Last Friday, the Albanese government revealed that the Port of Darwin will remain Chinese-owned as per a 99-year lease to a Beijing-controlled company, Landbridge. Now, this is despite the Prime Minister's criticism of the lease prior to the last election as, quote, a grave error of judgment. To say what a backflip. And it's another concerning development that demonstrates Labor isn't serious on defence. Joining me to get to the latest on this and more is Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, Michael Shoebridge. Michael, thank you for joining me. What's changed here? Why has the government decided to allow Chinese ownership of our most strategic port in the north of Australia, even though the PM was against the arrangement before the election?
Well, Cory, three things have changed. First, Mr Albanese now is in power, so he has the authority to end this lease to the Chinese-owned company. The second thing is the Americans are spending even more money on things like fuel storage up in Darwin because they understand its strategic significance. And we're seeing Marines and other US forces work with Australia up there. So they've seen it as more important. And the third thing, which is probably the reason this review went nowhere, is Mr Albanese is prioritising shaking hands with China's Xi Jinping over this management of our strategic port in our north. If Mr Albanese has any doubts about whether this is a good or a bad thing to leave that Chinese port operator in place, he should ask the Pentagon on his trip now if they'd be happy having our AUKUS East Coast submarine base in Newcastle, where there's another Chinese port operator.
Well, Michael, here's a question I know a lot of people ask. Instinctively, they say they don't want the Communist Party to control Australia's ports, particularly one as strategic as Darwin. But what are the real risks for Australia in having a foreign communist entity in charge of such critical infrastructure?
Well, Cory, in Darwin Harbour, this part of the port that's operated by this Chinese company is on the best real estate. The harbour is pretty constricted, and this is in the primary position. It means that sensitive military supplies and items can't really use that part of the port. So there's workarounds having to use other parts of Darwin Harbour. It's not about monitoring and regulation. It's about the opportunity cost of not being able to use that single best piece of real estate in Darwin Harbour for our joint security needs.
It's quite an extraordinary decision, which I note was taken under a previous coalition government. Michael, the Prime Minister is in DC at the moment. He's trying to lobby US Congress to back President Biden's bill promising billions for the AUKUS submarine program. But there seems to be considerable opposition to AUKUS within certain parts of the Republican Party. Why is this, and what do you think the Prime Minister's chances of success over there are?
Well, Cory, like Australians, Americans like to see their taxpayers' money spent on American things. We like to see it spent on Australian things. And right now, the American national security community is realising that just at the time Australia wants them to give us some of their own nuclear submarines, the Virginia class in the early 2030s, that's when the US Navy will have the smallest number of those submarines over the last few decades. So right when it's getting harder for America to do this, we're insisting they hand them over. And they haven't seen us put our real money where our mouth is yet and take hard decisions like where this East Coast base is going to be, where the waste repository is going to be.
Yeah, well, that's true. They cancelled a waste repository here in South Australia because of complaints from the Indigenous local people, and that's left us in a world of questions as to what happens with our nuclear submarines. But there is so much going on in the world of national security and geo-global politics. But last week there was an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza, and now we're seeing a ramp-up of precision airstrikes, meaning the US has signalled it's going to send extra deployments into the region. This frightens a lot of people. Where do you see it going, and what do you think we can expect next?
Well, Cory, the Israelis have no alternative but to put their military in in large numbers into Gaza. That's why they've been trying to get so many of the Palestinian civilians out of northern Gaza, so that they can dismantle the Hamas terrorist network, including probably 200 kilometres worth of underground tunnels and facilities. Some of them for rocket making, some of them the hostages will be held in. So the Israeli military are going to go in force into Gaza, but at the same time, the Israelis and the Americans are telling Iran to stay out of this war, and Iran is so far willing to spend the lives of Hezbollah and Hamas proxies, but not confront the Americans or the Israelis. That's good news.
Yeah, and we'll have to keep a close eye on it to make sure it doesn't escalate any further. Michael Shoebridge, thanks for your time and your expertise.